Welcome to Cassette Connection, the podcast where we discuss music and meaning with the people who make it. My name is Ben, and with me is Alex.
This episode, we're talking to Millie Watson. Millie is a classical pianist, modern composer and producer currently based in London. Millie has appeared in multiple ensembles, but off the back of her first solo release, she's continued to develop as an artist.
We discuss with Millie her approach to writing and performing music, both solo and in ensembles. We get an insight into her feelings and motivations when developing ideas for her music and how she creates her own musical identity.
Take a listen.
My name's Millie Watson. I am from Canberra, heart of the nation. I grew up playing piano as a, typical extracurricular thing that I just did, and I never had the balls to tell my parents I didn't want to practice. So I just did that until I was lucky enough to have a really decent teacher in high school, and she was really encouraged interpretation. So I followed that, and then when I was looking for universities to apply to, she said, you have to audition, because if you don't do piano at university, you'll never play the instrument again, which is quite a harsh thing. Anyway, so I did, and I went to the ANU and studied classical piano there, performance, and as well as English literature. And the classical piano stuff was just the best thing. I think deciding to do that as my degree was the best thing that I ever did. Classical music performance practice, or any performance practice, really makes you have to come to terms with your ego and be comfortable expressing yourself and being comfortable on stage, which I'm forever grateful for. Even if, and most importantly, even if you're not particularly happy with the product, you still have to not apologize, because it's, all the process. So I did my classical piano degree. I went away for a year and I came back for my honours year, and I had this weird thing where I couldn't remember sheet music anymore. I just couldn't get the notes to stick, and it was quite upsetting. So I was about to drop out of my honours year, and then one of my supervisors was like, well, why don't you compose and you play gigs all the time, why wouldn't you just use that music as your honours year thesis? Because throughout undergrad, we were lucky to have Alec come in as a lecturer, and he kind of opened our eyes to experimental performance and how compositional practice feeds into, even my classical piano practice. So performing the works of C.P. Bach with an experimental improvisation approach really opened my eyes to the possibilities. So from there I've just been playing solo gigs. My sets started off largely as pre-recorded tape from Found Sounds, and then I would improvise on the piano along with that. But then that has kind of turned into a live looping thing. And my current project is trying to not hide behind my fingers anymore and actually use my voice. I think coming from a context where you're given the music, it took me a long time to learn how to be comfortable improvising, first at the piano and then away from the piano. And then, a part of this, as every undergrad music student will experience, you go through the Cage years. And the thing about John Cage that really, transformed the way that I perform and interact with other improvisers was just the acceptance of everything, and just accepting, those mistakes that you make are often the ones that define your piece. And then taking that one step further with found sound and soundscapes and field recordings, the complexity and of, a bus engine, that's something I could never compose, you know, the complexity of the interaction between the wind and the birds. It all sounds very whimsical, but it's just something that I could never have the capacity to imagine, but I can harness those sounds. And if you it's more like scrapbooking, I guess. Sometimes that's how I feel about it, is that you find those complexities and then you stitch them together. But I think that certainly learning how to listen was just an enormously important thing. And it sounds so simple, but I think given my, I guess, white bread piano upbringing, you don't really think about it like that. And so that's fed into the way my aesthetic has developed, because I think finding your voice is a really difficult thing, and obviously it never stops. But I think that, yeah, I have a very clear harmonic aesthetic when I'm at the piano, but that feeds into everything. So I try and draw and I try and write, and it doesn't matter if I'm good at it or not. It's more if you develop your craft in every medium, it becomes a more holistic approach, and I think that comes through in the recordings that you make. Because every time you sit down to draw, every time you sit down to jam with someone, that's just another brick in your overall aesthetic. Free improvisation versus jazz improvisation in some ways, I think if you're a really good jazz improviser, and the same if you're a really good free improviser, they're the same thing, just in a slightly different language. In that free improvisation is all about, for me anyway, I find free improvisation is much more about the texture of what you're playing, and then the form builds from there. And in jazz, your language is harmonic, but the further you get into both, the more jazz sounds like free improvisation, I guess, and the more free improvisation has the capacity to sound like jazz, because if you're a good free improviser, you have the capacity to build a structure on the spot. I guess the thing with jazz, and the same with classical music as well, the problem is the temptation is to be referential. Like, you want to refer, people will be playing an improvisation, they'll quote giant steps and everyone laughs because everyone likes to be part of the club. That's what I find difficult about kind of the mainstream, or your tip. I don't know. I don't want to be unfair to some, but I find that with some jazz, the gentrified jazz, it's very much we're in on the joke because I get that reference and, oh, did you hear what he did there? A bit kooky, but it's still very much about chops. And free improvisation really helped me lose my ego when I was playing. The only reason why I still practice classical pieces because I want to have the ability to realize the idea I have at the piano when it comes. But I battle a lot with, trying not to play too much, especially, in a solo show when I'm at the piano and I feel like I'm running out of ideas. I definitely have licks that I fall back on all the time. And it's a bit disappointing when that happens. And you're like, wow, that was a bit lazy, wasn't it? Because you're like, maybe they're not liking the music enough. So if I show them I can play the piano pretty well, that might win people over. But I think that's just a really apologetic and a bit of a lazy way of approaching it, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how well I can play the piano as long as they've enjoyed the experience. And I find some of my favorite shows or sets have been really simple, repetitive performances, but they're sincere, and that comes through because as soon as you start just throwing things around because you're not sure what to play, that's not sincere, and it's not really a part of the music in the end.
It's a nice way to, I guess, kind of describe, instead of it being like some kind of kitsch or cliche kind of thing of being like, find your own voice. I think sincerity is like a really good way of phrasing it.
Yeah. And I think that's why, certainly for me, I think we've talked about this a bit, Ben, but the music that I was listening to and the music that I was playing, they were just completely different. And it was really confusing to me. Like, I go home and I listen to these amazing musicians like FKA Twigs, I obviously love. And you hear people doing, and Nicholas Jar, they're doing these amazing things, but in a relevant context. Because my day to day, I love all of that music, and then I would go away and play like avant-garde stuff. That is the problem. I think it's so easy to lean on improvisation, and then the problem is, I mean, I've played so many shows, but every time I play a show, I've never played the same set twice, because I'm like, oh no, I don't like those ideas anymore. I'm just going to completely write a new set. So I've never played the same set twice, and I think that's to my detriment, because I haven't actually, all of those pieces, I mean, they just don't exist anymore. I've never practiced them. They haven't been polished. I couldn't even tell you where they are in my library. First of all, extra musical things, like I said earlier, it just adds a complexity you can't compose. But at the same time, it also, field recordings just bring a sense of space to a production that you can't recreate. And it's bizarre. I have a friend of mine who we used to go and do field recordings together, and he's a drum and bass producer. And his would be like, they're like bona fide drum and bass tracks, but he would put in just really, really low in the mix, just as a field recording, but it wouldn't have anything in it really. It was just like us standing around. It wasn't even like by a busy road or by birds, but that feeling of space really made a difference. And I thought that was super interesting. It's just one of those unseen things that makes a huge difference.
It's hard because when you're playing completely instrumental music, you can say, this is programmatic music, or because this field recording's in here, it means X, but at the same time, it is completely up for interpretation. So I don't know what kind of themes you might have been exploring in the past.
I think, to be honest, in the past, I just wasn't as, I think when you study music and people say, what do you do? And you say, I'm a musician, then it sounds like you kind of have this idea of yourself. But I think, having finished university and now working, a job in real estate, it has been it's been very challenging, but at the same time, I think it's really made me have to understand what my music is. And now I think, well, what's the point in writing a piece that no one wants to listen to? Like, at the end of the day, and I think when you're in the ivory tower, it's really like, oh, I'm terribly smart. Do you know what I did here? Very clever. But I didn't think about the audience enough. And I don't know if this is my classical background or if it's just all musicians, but in the early days, you kind of think, well, of course the audience is there. I'm creating pieces, but the audience is like some homogenous thing that just kind of exists, and the audience will always exist. But at the end of the day, it just doesn't, and there's no point. I don't know. I think unless you have an actual message, there's no point making people feel uncomfortable because you think that you're being clever. I think discomfort is an important artistic practice, because often art reflects the messages that people don't want to hear. And so in some contexts, discomfort is really important. But for me personally, what I was playing, I was just trying to understand why I was playing, I guess. And I struggled with the fact that my music was I felt very selfish, and privileged playing music all the time. And so I was so privileged that I could play music no one wanted to listen to, which is obscene. In the Western art canon, it's all about the composer, and it's all very much personality driven. They're the big dog. So you don't really, and that encourages an idea of abstract music. That's from, I mean, wasn't that Stravinsky? He was big into like the idea that music is just, it exists and it doesn't need to have a meaning. and so you kind of get caught up in that idea. You're like, it's okay for it to just exist. But the truth is, it's never happened like that. And it never will happen like that. And I had one composer who came in and was talking to us about our things. And I had a tutorial with him. And then he said, what's the name of the piece? And I said, I don't have a name. I was just going to call it, like, I don't know, or piece 1. And he was like, well, then what's the point? I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, if the piece has a point, you should have a name for it. And if it doesn't have a point, then you shouldn't have written it. And I was like, oh, it's a really good point. Yeah. But, yeah, trying to articulate. I think instrumental music can be a bit cheeky because it's much easier to dodge any. It's like the sincerity thing again, because it's so, it's you can't articulate it. You can get away with it, like, oh, it's up to interpretation, but I think, and it's never literal. So it's much easier to be insincere in classical music, or Western art music. You can say, oh, I meant it to be this thing, and you can just change your meaning depending on who you're talking to, which is cheeky.
How's your classical practice informed the music, and then how have you kind of taken that and broken free of it with the production side of things?
So I guess the first thing that I ever wrote, first composition, was in high school, and we were learning about Impressionism. So I wrote this Debussy-esque piece, which, my teachers were actually quite taken by, because I've always been quite an average student. But it was the first time I'd created a musical piece outside of my piano lessons, and someone had been like, "Oh, wow, that's sick." But ever since then, I think I've always had a really impressionist harmonic language, because Debussy was the first composer that I ever fully, looked into with any kind of depth, and then tried to imitate, I guess. So that's just kind of stuck with me. And then in terms of, historically informed performance, I was actually really taken by this in my third year, because one of my favorite composers is C.P. Bach, and he wrote these amazing fantasias, which are just so emotionally driven. There's no bar lines, so there's a very genuine sense of freedom and really emotive themes. I think he's just weirdly forgotten about. But in my second year, I was learning from Adam Cook, who was Larry Sitzky's former student, and he's probably the most talented musician I've ever met. It's crazy. Like, he can play everything, and he can play it. He just has that depth of understanding where it's just genre just doesn't matter, because he can understand the deeper musical concept immediately, and he can play in the style. So he's got crazy jazz chops, and he's also, extremely accomplished classical performer. But for my tech and rep, I played my first ever jazz standard, and it was awful in my exam, because it was stride down the bottom. So I had that, and then I had a Bach prelude, which he then got me to take apart. And so he was like, this isn't written for the piano. This is written for an old instrument, an old keyboard instrument. So why don't we rewrite it for the piano? So he really challenged me that way to say, look, obviously the score is here, but the score isn't everything. You have the capacity to play with it and bring depth to it, because we've got new instruments, we've got new technology, so we need to adapt it for the new technology. So that really opened my eyes to composing within the classical structure. And since then, I've pushed and pulled a lot of the scores that I played to varying success. I don't think I've played in time for a very long time, but so that kind of thing, it was just like a really gradual process. And then I can't remember the first time. I think my boyfriend at the time was a recording engineer, and then we were talking about it, and I was like, I really want to pick up the laptop, because I know that in our experimental music ensemble sessions, like you and Ben, everyone kind of knew their way around technology a little bit. So I was like, I want to learn how to do it, because I want to, be able to record myself, or, make make beats. I never made a beat in my life, but yeah. So then it was just kind of a gradual overlap because I saw other people doing these things, and I was like, well, I really want to learn. And I also love Edgar Varese, who's famous for using tape in the first use of tape in an orchestral setting in the 1920s. And I thought that was great. And I started getting this chip on my shoulder that what I was doing by playing classical repertoire was just perpetuating this really negative, I guess, it's just this negative cycle of playing dead people's music, which in itself is not problematic. But I read this quote from Edgar Varese in 1919, and he said, classical music is a modern graveyard. And it is. And that was 100 years ago he said that. And we're playing his music as if it's new music because it's interesting, but it's just not. And I know people have this conversation all the time, but nothing seems to really change. But it was obscene. And so I was like, oh, well, I should probably start learning the technology that I have today. Because if you want to be a serious composer, I just think you need to be interested in things at least. So anyway, I took to that and then started field recording with my Zoom H1, which is, very user-friendly. And then I wasn't really sure what to do to begin with because I was kind of used to people, I'd have a course for something. If I didn't know how to do it, I'll just learn about it at uni and have a course on it. But this time I had to feel around. So I just watched a lot of YouTube videos. And then, I don't know. It was more just, it's the kind of thing where you acquire the skill as you need it. So if you've got the basics you can record in, okay, great. And then you can start, cutting and chopping it up. Great. I learned how to fade. That was handy. And then it just built from there. So, I mean, it's still very much DIY. But sometimes I think that the more training you have in something, the more it clouds your vision. So in some ways, I'm pleased to have this instrument that I don't have the baggage of, historical performance along with it. The prepared piano is just the most fantastic thing because it kind of brings back a sense of like childlike, wonder, because it's everything you do. I like that it's very much physical. It's like I touch the string here and it makes this sound. If I scrape it here, that kind of a thing, which sometimes I find on the laptop to be difficult, is that there's no tactile correlation, I guess, between sound and action. But on the prepared piano, it's just completely that. So, I mean, I love that it's just this instrument of, Alec, our lecturer, he's like, it's the most oppressive instrument, the dictator of the classical world. But I think when you play prepared piano, it really does show you, it's amazing that we have this whole palette that just no one cares about. I think Kelly Moran, she writes a lot of prepared piano music, and I respect her because she's taken something which maybe a lot of people think was a gimmick, and she makes really nice and really decent music out of it. So yeah, the prepared piano definitely expanded my palette. It's just fun. It's nice to have fun while you're performing. And it's much more, because it's so rhythmic and diverse, it feels much more conversational. So when you're playing, in an improvised setting with our ensemble, it's fun being able to interact, and you can, it's got everything from the low grumble to a chatter, and then you're laughing on the piano, but then it can be really sad and emotive, and the preparation just opens up these possibilities. And it sounds weirdly alien as well, which I think is interesting. It's really unrecognizable, even though all you've done is put some rubber seals in the strings. But yeah, so that was a big part of my album, actually, was using prepared piano, and how they are imitating life in a very unsubtle way by having, the field recordings would be in there, and then I would extend that field recording sound palette with the prepared piano. Because I think a big part of the composition that I write is sonic serendipity, is my snappy catchphrase. Because I'm a big believer that things line up, I just think they do. I'll just drop something in. Like when I was making my album, I would just drop in a sample and it would just line up perfectly. because you are always looking for connections. I think that's, just a classic human thing. You're always looking for meaning in a story. So when you just drop in things and line them up, they just tend to work. So that's what I found with prepared piano and found sounds. They just always work together. What gets me excited? What am I listening to? The new Perfume Genius album is really good. I highly recommend that. It's so there's a thing about Perfume Genius. Well, I think the musicians that I admire most at the moment are the musicians who have a whole aesthetic, and you can really see that it's not like they've written good songs. Their whole visual aesthetic somehow exists at the same time as their audio one. Even if you're just listening to the song, you can kind of, I don't know, it all seeps through. So Perfume Genius, Christine and the Queens definitely falls into that category. And then and FK Twigs, obviously. James Blake as well, I would say. So, I mean, I think I like these artists because they're so committed to their craft and their aesthetic that there's just completely no, I don't know, there's no apology. Tyler, the Creator, would be another big example of that. He's really developed like a holistic thing. So in terms of, I wouldn't say musically those people influence me, but certainly in the way that they cultivate their full persona is making me think a lot more about how my visuals associated with my art will interact. But at the moment, I've been listening to a lot of Hildegard von Bingen, who's probably known to a lot of people. She's the nun from 13th century nun. She's I don't know if you know this story, but she's basically one of the first people to notate music. And it's great because when she's listed in historical things, she's never listed as the first female composer. She's just kind of like one of the first composers. But she had all these rad visions and stuff that she drew. There's this cosmic egg, which she drew after a vision from God because she said that the angels came and spoke to her and everything. But it just looks like an enormous vagina. And it's hilarious. And you're like, I don't know, it's just bizarre. It's this really interesting cosmic, happening. But her music is great because the melodic lines, they're quite, they're old school, modal things. But the rhythm is so weird. And because she's coming at it from a religious perspective, there's it's not broken up into 4 groups of 4 or anything like that. It's just the melodic line will go for as long as that sentence is. And she'll string things out, but her harmony is still, I don't know. It's really interesting listening. And I have an obsession with medieval stuff because I love that in their day-to-day it was all so mystical. Like their religion was so mystical, and you look at all the art and that's just so earthy. So that's kind of the vision for my next release is like a medieval, it's all earthy but a bit mystical at the same time. So yeah, Hildegard von Bingen, look her up. She's great. And she didn't start writing music till she was 40, so there's hope for us yet.
How do you think your setting has influenced you? Because you've moved around quite a bit.
Yeah. I think it's one of the problems that I need to overcome is that I think I have an obsession with novelty. So, moving's been really good because I find that I meet interesting people who I wouldn't meet otherwise, who are outside of my echo chamber. And that kind of off-the-cuff interaction is really, I think the more you're alone and around people you don't know, the more you feel like yourself. Well, that's how I feel anyway. So when I'm when I'm in that kind of a space, then I find it much easier to write music and to improvise because everything's off the cuff, when I put down ideas and stuff, they tend to be off the cuff and they tend to just work really well. But at the same time, it means that I don't have my piano around with me, which is really difficult, because I think that that's always going to be my primary instrument. So when I'm trying to write a song, even though down the line it actually won't have piano in it, when I'm trying to think of melody and harmony, sitting down at the piano is the best thing, and you can sound out ideas and that kind of thing. But living in London at the moment, I've got no space. I don't have a desk in my room, and I've only got like MIDI instruments. So it's quite difficult for me to get into the create ideas headspace. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, really, because you get the emotional content, but then you don't really have, I feel like I have less capacity to realize it because I just don't have the space.
The track you just heard was Swimming by Millie Watson, taken from her debut album, Things I Know to Be True. You can find more information on Millie's work on our website, cassetteconnection.com. Letters to the editor with Ben Harb.
Letters to the editor.
Letters from the editor, maybe.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you get letters? Yeah, you do.
I guess.
No, I thought it was a great conversation. Millie and I are good friends, and we've played together for quite some time when we are in the same place. But her solo work is really, really beautiful. I think she kind of picks up on all the ideas that she's learned over time, over her studies, over her just performance and practice. In music, you can hear all the nice melodies, the nice harmonic ideas, and then even bringing in the prepared piano ideas that she talks about. It's a fun way to explore the piano, I think.
Totally, very different.
Yeah, you get, new sounds. What's that, a little twang? That's cool. But no, I thought it was a great conversation. Thanks to Millie for being on the show, for being our first guest on the show. And thank you for listening to our first ever episode of Cassette Connection. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Cassette Connection is recorded and produced by Ben Harb and Alex Ferrugia. For more information, head to our website, cassetteconnection.com.
You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Cassette Connection. And if you would like to be featured or just want to get in touch, our email is contact@cassetteconnection.com.